Greetings, citizens. Hey you beautiful creepy little human being you. Welcome to my channel and welcome to today's morbid makeup video. I'm so happy we could meet like this. I'm so happy that somehow in all of this craziness, today you and I were able to find each other on this crazy little planet that we call home. My name is Brittany or BRATTERSTEIN, whichever you prefer, and today we're going to be discussing a man named Devon Scheanette, or as he's better known as, the Bathtub Killer. But before we get started, if you have not yet had the pleasure, please make sure to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing that bell. I put out a new morbid makeup video every single week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you specifically you, but I can only do that if you join the Brat Pack and become one of us. One of us. One of us. One of us. And you can also follow me on Instagram and Twitter if you want. They're both BRATTERSTEIN, but no pressure. Okay, now that I'm done begging you to join my cult, we can get into this video. Now, this is a video that I've wanted to cover a while because it's a case that I heard about a couple years ago. And when I first heard the details of this case, every few seconds I was like, I'm sorry, what? But I don't want to give too much away. I don't want to give you too many details right now because I have gotten feedback from one person that just kind of got under my skin that said that I give too much about the case away right at the beginning of the case. So I'm not going to do that. But let me just tell you, this guy was an actual monster, okay? This guy was a serial rapist and murderer who terrorized the area of Arlington, Texas in the 1990s. And he killed women in such a very specific way. He had a very specific death murder ritual, and it was so specific that one officer said that in walking into the second murder scene, he felt like he was experiencing deja vu. With all of that said, today I'm going to tell you the entire story, and while I do, I'm going to be putting on a face of makeup, hence the makeup in morbid makeup. Now, if that's not really your thing, that's okay. Thanks for hanging out this long. I hope you find a channel that you enjoy more. But if you're on the fence, you're not sure how you feel, or if you are into it, stick around. I think you could be surprised by just how much you like it. So I think it's time that we stop talking about it and start being about it. So come, gather around, and let me tell you the story of Devon Scheanette, the Bathtub Killer. We're going to start our story today by jumping in our handy-dandy time machine and heading to September 17th, 1996 in Arlington, Texas at the Pear Tree apartment complex. A young man named Thyme arrived home after a long day of work. It was the end of the day. He was done. He had worked all day. He was ready to go home and chill at home. He gets home and the door is locked. Seems totally normal, right? He'd been gone all day. You lock the door when you leave. Except for that it wasn't normal because of a couple of reasons. The first reason was that Thyme did not live alone. He had been living in this apartment with his girlfriend, a 25-year-old woman named Christine Vu. Though some sources say she was 26, so 25 or 26-year-old woman named Christine Vu. And Christine was a teacher. I believe she taught third grade, and she was always off before him. Without fail, she was off before him. She was always home before him. You know, when you have a routine with somebody you live with, you know. So she should be home. And two, when he went to actually unlock the door, he found that it was locked from the inside. They had a deadbolt, so it was locked from the inside, which meant somebody was in the apartment. Because that's the only way that the door could get locked from the inside. So Thyme gets home. He thinks this is a little bit weird because, like, why would Christine have the door locked? She knew he was coming home. This wasn't their normal schedule. You know, women, what is she doing in there? So he starts knocking on the door, banging on the door, yelling inside the door, and is getting no response from his girlfriend, Christine. After a little bit of time, Thyme just gave up. He's like, you know what? Maybe she's in the shower, maybe she's in the bathroom, something where she just can't hear me. So I'm gonna go downstairs. I'm gonna smoke a quick cigarette. I'm gonna give her a second to like get to an area where she can actually hear me knocking. And then I'm gonna head up and do this whole shebang all over again. So he goes downstairs. He smokes a cigarette. He chills, not kills, for a couple of minutes, and then he heads back up to the apartment, and still the door is locked from the inside. He knocks, no response. He's like, what the fuck, this is weird. So that's when he decides to go to the common area gym at the apartment complex he lived because there was a phone there. He goes there and he's like, okay, I'll call her. There's not a good chance that she's not gonna hear the house phone or the cell phone. 96, probably a house phone from inside the bathroom. So he goes, he dials the number, and then just listens to it ring and ring and ring, and still there's no response. So now I can only imagine that he's like angry, but also worried, just knowing how men generally are. Wow, I'm sorry, man, I'm really generalizing about you right now, but I just assumed that you would be worried, but also a little bit annoyed because you're just like done with your day. You just got off work. You're just trying to get inside and relax, and your woman's not opening the door for you, but maybe I'm generalizing a little bit here. Either way, he is worried, and he goes back up to the apartment now, and he's ready to like really bang on that door. So he gets there, he starts to bang on the door, he goes and he turns the doorknob again, but this time the door opens. So somebody has unlocked it from the inside. Oh no. Way to break the tension with this makeup brush falling on the floor. Sorry about that. So the door opens, and he lets himself into a very quiet apartment. He walks through the apartment trying to see what he can find, and he ends up making his way into the bathroom. And that's where he found the worst thing anyone could possibly find. And that is his girlfriend, the woman he loved, the woman he lived with, 25 to 26-year-old Christine Vu, dead in the bathtub. She was face down in the bathtub that was partially filled with water. She had been hog-tied with duct tape, so she had her wrists and her ankles wrapped in duct tape, pulled behind her back with like a piece of tape connecting the two behind her back. And she was naked, and she was dead. And a later autopsy confirmed that she had been strangled, raped, and drowned. So Thyme freaked out, called 911, and he was crying and screaming, just totally inconsolable, as I'm sure you can imagine. I cannot even put myself in that situation because it is my actual nightmare for anything to happen to my husband. So for him to come home and find this hits me right there, man. But he called police, and police arrived, and they didn't really buy his intense emotional response. They thought that he was kind of like that it was kind of bullshit because his story to them just seemed insane. Though police didn't really buy Thyme's emotional response to his girlfriend's murder, they thought that what he was saying was kind of bullshit because the story does seem kind of insane if you really think about it. He was super, super cooperative. He did everything he could to help police. He answered every question. He didn't ask for an attorney. He offered up DNA, saliva, all that, and it was all tested. And he was ruled out because he was not a match. In addition to that, police found I believe it was a thumbprint. It was a fingerprint, one of these little digits. A print was left on the deadbolt of the indoor lock, the one that was keeping him out of the apartment. And this fingerprint didn't match either Thyme or Christine Vu. Which, if you really think about that, that whole situation is insane, because that means that everything that Thyme said, his whole story was true. Which means when he came home and found the door locked from the inside, whoever killed Christine was still in that unit and could have presumably been still killing her at that moment. So while he's outside banging, trying to get inside to see his girlfriend, somebody is in there killing her in the bathtub or concealing the crime scene, something fucked up, right? And is just like hoping that Thyme's gonna go away because he's like, fuck, what am I gonna do? But it's just horrible. And then he goes downstairs and he goes to smoke a cigarette. And while that happens, this person is able to slip out of the apartment without Thyme or anyone else seeing him. So while Thyme was downstairs smoking a cigarette, trying to get into his apartment, this person murdered his girlfriend and then just escaped without anyone seeing him and like ran off into the night. That's fucking wild. So police try to investigate Christine's murder, but they're coming up with no credible leads because everyone just seemed to like Christine. She didn't really have any enemies. There was no one in her life that was holding a grudge. So it seemed like this must be a stranger. They had already ruled out Thyme, and most women statistically are killed by their romantic partners. So police were just kind of like left with, what the fuck? Like, what's up? What are we going to do here? But it wouldn't take long for them to realize that they were dealing with a stranger and they were dealing with an actual monster. And by not long, I mean they would find this out just 3 months later. On the evening of Christmas Eve, 1996, freaking Christmas Eve, dude, police are dispatched to a murder scene. Now, as investigators enter the apartment of 22-year-old teacher's aide, Wendie Prescott, though some sources say she was 23, apparently we can't get the ages of these women correct, 22 or 23-year-old Wendie Prescott, they are smacked in the face with a sense of deja vu. As investigators entered the bathroom, they found Wendie Prescott dead in her bathtub. She was face down in a partially filled bathtub with her hands and her ankles duct taped behind her back with a long strip of tape connecting the two, effectively hog-tying her, and she was nude and dead. An autopsy later confirmed that she had been raped, she had been strangled, and she had been drowned, and that she was tied up like this prior to being killed. At this scene, both semen and fingerprints were also found. Now that already sounds super fucking familiar, right? You'd already be like, oh shit, like we're dealing with the same person. It's gonna get a little bit weirder, because did I mention that this happened at the Pear Tree apartment complex? Yeah, dude. The exact same apartment complex where Christine Vu had been murdered just 3 months earlier in the exact same way. Now Wendie Prescott was being killed in the exact same apartment complex. Literally the layouts of the apartment were almost the exact same. And their apartments were only about 150 feet away from each other. Isn't that crazy? That's the part of this case that I was like, I'm sorry, what? So that means that when officers arrived, they walked into basically the same apartment, through the same door, through the same floor plan to find a woman dead in the exact same way. And that freaks me the fuck out. So what had happened that led up to police finding Wendie's body is that Wendie had plans that day. It was Christmas Eve, which is already so fucked up. And she had plans that day to meet up with her sister and go do some Christmas shopping. But she never arrived, never met up with her sister, never called, nothing happened. So that was already strange. But when she didn't arrive that night for a Christmas Eve family dinner, that's when her family were really like, okay, what the fuck? So they waited as long as they could, just kind of trying to get a hold of her, hoping that maybe she was running late, maybe something was going on. But at 11 p.m., when they still hadn't heard from her, they realized that that was it. That was their bottom line. It had been long enough. Something was definitely off. This is when her aunt and uncle, saying enough was enough, this was Norman and Brenda Norwood, headed over to Wendie's apartment, and they let themselves in with a spare key that they knew that she hid outside her apartment. And when they went inside, this is when they found Wendie in a very freakishly similar state to how investigators had found Christine previously. So when police first started investigating this murder, even though they thought the two cases were obviously connected, they still had to investigate this case individually at first and, look into the victim, find out who the victim knew, see if there was anybody who would want to hurt her, see if there was anybody who would have reason to hurt her, if she had any enemies. And when looking into who she was as a person and who she had in her circle, this is when they found something interesting that they thought was a pretty credible lead. They had spoken to Wendie's older sister, Skyla, and this is when Skyla informed investigators that yes, Wendie did actually have an enemy. She had a man who had been stalking her for months, and it got so bad that Wendie had even filed a domestic assault report. Now, I couldn't find if this man was an ex-boyfriend or who this man was to Wendie, but domestic assault leads me to believe it might have been a boyfriend, but either way, Wendie's sister Skyla said of this man in this situation, and I quote, "He kept making threats that she was going to die in the same way her mother did. Threatened her. He hit her. She would call me at night saying he was talking crazy." Now, if you're like me, you probably heard that quote and you were like, I'm sorry, what? It's very Scream, right? Like Scream 1, like if you hang up with me, you'll die just like your mother. Anyways, the reason that he would say this to her is because Wendie's mother, when Wendie was only 3 years old, was actually murdered. In June of 1977, she was strangled to death in a park, and this murder was never solved. Which is just like, to have a mother and then her daughter both murdered is so horrible, and apparently Wendie lived her life with an irrational fear, though I don't think it's that irrational, that something like that would happen to her. And then this happened. It's so fucked up. It's so sad though, because Wendie's aunt, said that after Christine was killed in that apartment complex, it really, really, really affected Wendie, and it freaked her out and it scared her, but that she put it out of her mind because she thought to herself, like, what are the odds that two women would be murdered in the exact same apartment complex? Like, astronomically low, right? So she put it out of her mind, even though she said that seeing all the lights and like the police sirens and knowing that happened there had brought back a lot of trauma regarding her mom's murder for her, that she just assumed that she was probably safe. And then this happened to her. Isn't that just like so messed up? Like, oh that really gets my, like that. Ugh. Anyways, police looked into this guy and they cleared him. They found that he was not involved in Wendie's murder. So they then started to look at the two cases as being related and trying to see if there was anything that these women had in common, anything they could link them by besides the fact that they both lived in the Pear Tree apartment complex and that they were both involved in teaching with, Wendie being a teacher's aide and Christine being a teacher. So they looked into them. In doing so, they found that both women had just recently started moving out on their own, living out of their families' homes, and that they had both ended up in this apartment complex because it was like well-maintained, friendly, it was in a good area, the rent was at a low average of $463 a month, which, like, I know inflation's a thing, but my God, can you even imagine? And anyway, and that the apartment complex was in walking distance of 5 schools, and they both worked with schools, so it was just very convenient. But that was pretty much where the similarities and connections ended as far as who they were as people. In both cases, there was also no sign of forced entry, no sign of a robbery, and there were no other connections between the two women. An Arlington homicide detective said of these murders, and I quote, "The crime scenes were absolutely horrific, brutal, and violent. The worst nightmare for anyone confronted with that kind of attack. I don't like to think what the ladies went through." DNA was left at both crime scenes because this guy was messy. Messy, but experienced is what at least police were thinking, because they, in looking at the scenes and seeing how brutal they were, how intense the way he murdered them was, how like specific his death ritual was, there was no possible way that he had not done this before. These just simply could not have been his first kills. Police were confused though, because they took the DNA that was left at both crime scenes and they were able to test it against each other and see that yes, it was in fact the same killer. But when they ran it through the system, there were no hits. So if this was not this guy's first violent crimes, he had never been caught before and he was not in the system. So police were like, shit, now what do we do? So they start looking in to people who would be familiar with the apartment complex, because they figured that this had to have been connected, because both women were killed in the exact same apartment complex. So they wanted to find anybody who would be familiar with the layout and how things work, somebody who had lived there before, somebody who still lived there, a maintenance worker, just somebody connected with the Pear Tree apartment complex. The problem with this was that because of the murders, people were like moving out in hordes. People did not want to live there. And most of the people who moved out were other young women, young teachers, because apparently this was an area that a lot of young, not academics. This baby's stealing all my brain cells. Young teachers, let's just say that. Young women teachers lived there because it was so close to so many schools and so affordable. So a lot of young women were like, there's something up here, I'm gonna dip. And they left. But they were able to test a lot of young men. They thought the killer was a man. Oh my God, what's up with my head? Police were able to get many, many men who lived both in or around the Pear Tree apartments to submit to DNA, to fingerprints, to give some of their biological material to exclude them. And from doing this, police were able to test and exclude about 300 men through either DNA, fingerprints, or just them having solid alibis. There was a lot of fear in the community and in the police department. The fear is that you don't want this to happen again. At that time, there was some incredible panic in those apartment complexes. People moved out in masses. It was just an incredible time. A 28-year-old woman named Tammy, who lived in the apartment complex at the time, said of the time, and I quote, "It gives me the creeps. I see these locked security gates, and all I can think is, we're not locking the evil out. We're locking him inside with us every night." People were just really scared, and they thought that there was a serial killer. Rightfully so. I would think the exact same thing. The lead investigator said of the serial killer situation and theory, and I quote, "When do you deem someone a serial murderer? Is it 2 victims? Is it 4? There's no way of knowing if the individual would strike again, but obviously he had struck twice. We do believe one person is responsible for the deaths." A team of detectives worked tirelessly to try to find anyone responsible for these murders. And even though there was even a reward offered of $20,000 that was offered up by both the apartment management, which I thought was really cool, and some local dairy factory is what I read, they offered a combined $20,000. Still, no arrests were made, no leads came out of it. It was like this guy was a ghost, or no one knew what he was doing. The case then just went cold for 18 months. This guy went from killing 2 women, 2 seemingly unrelated women in the same apartment complex over a period of a 3-month time span, which is like pretty close, pretty back to back for a murderer, right? He went from doing that to going over a year without doing anything, and this completely stumped police. And from there, the killings that were committed by a man that the media had now dubbed as the Bathtub Killer went unsolved for years. So now we're fast forwarding to February of 1999, and this is when the Bathtub Killer struck again. But He struck in a way that was very different, very odd for the typical escalation pattern that you see in killers like him. And because of that, this crime wasn't linked to him for some time. This attack was on a 22-year-old woman named Shima Benson. So Shima lived in a sorority house, and that night, the night of her attack, she went to bed, she went to sleep, and she woke up to a man on top of her. This man forced her to perform oral sex on him. But during the commission of this act, Shima, who was just a bad bitch, bit him hard on his downstairs region. Which, one, you fucking go, girl. Hell yeah to you, because fuck that guy. But two, because of this, he was pissed, as I'm sure you can imagine. And in response to this, he ended up beating the living hell out of her, raping her, and leaving her incapacitated in her room. She ended up needing 2 surgeries because of the damage done to her face, and she was beaten so bad that one of her eyes was completely swollen shut. But for some reason, this man let her live. He had just killed 2 women, but he let Shima live. Which is just like unheard of, right? Have you ever heard of a killer de-escalating like that? I don't know if I have. So this attack got good media attention, and due to the media coverage of this attempted murder, police get their first pretty credible lead. And that lead came when a young woman placed a call to police. This woman told police that she was a close friend of Wendie Prescott, the second murder victim, and that she had heard what had happened at the sorority house, and that that woman, that Shima Benson, that was attacked, well, that was supposed to be her. And police were like, that's really weird. What the fuck are you talking about, right? And that's when she tells police an interesting story. This woman tells police that she had lived in the same sorority house that Shima was living in prior to the attack, and that she had a pretty good idea who the attacker was. She said that she had been suffering from a stalker. Okay? Not the same stalker we talked about previous. Apparently there's just like a ton of stalkers in this story, which isn't surprising because there's a ton of stalkers out there, period. But either way, she said that she had been suffering from a stalker, and that the stalker knew she lived in the sorority house. So she actually moved out of the sorority house to get away from this man. And she said that she believed that this man was not only Shima's attacker, but also the murderer of both Christine and Wendie. So acting on this tip, police go and they recover the DNA sample taken from Shima's rape, and they compare it to Christine and Wendie's murders. Because prior to this, they hadn't connected the two, because it went from murdering 2 women to this random rape. They didn't think the 2 were connected, but they compared the DNA against each other, and boom, it was a match. The same person who had killed Christine and Wendie had raped and let Shima live. So police were like, what the fuck? But what's crazy is because they were like, okay, this girl thinks her ex-stalker is the person responsible. Like, it must be. That's where this tip is coming from. There's a reason this is all connected. So they bring this guy in. They run his DNA. Not a match. There's just a lot of bad people in this story. A lot of bad men in this story, but are not the bad man who did this. But this wasn't all a total loss. That was a big blow. This guy not being the killer was a big blow because they thought that they had gotten pretty lucky. But they had gotten lucky in another way, and that's that Shima had lived. So she had a pretty good description of what her attacker looked like. And she herself had made sure that he had a very distinct scar on his ween because she had bitten him so hard that she had drawn blood. Like, there was no way that wasn't going to leave a very noticeable scar on her attacker. An officer said of this description, and I quote, "This is a very sensitive description, but it's also a very specific description. He is uncircumcised, and he does have a very noticeable knot on his genitalia." Shortly after the attack on Shima, police got a call that yet another woman had been attacked. And when police got this call, their ears perked up because of the description that the woman had given of her attacker, because like Shima, this woman too had lived. The woman who was attacked's name was Adrian, and at the time of her attack, she was pregnant. She told police that she had gone to bed and woken up at 3 a.m. to the sound of a man just breathing in her apartment. She said that the man then attacked her and raped her for 2 hours before surprisingly leaving and letting her live. She said that as the man left, she asked him, like, why did you do this? Why would you do this to me? And he responded with, I don't know. I'm just mad at the world. That was his response to why he raped this pregnant woman for 2 hours at gunpoint. Was, I don't know, man, just mad at the world. So during all this time, police had DNA and had fingerprints, but they had yet to be able to find a match for anybody. But then, in the year 2000, there had been some advancements made to the APHIS system, the one that holds all the fingerprints and runs all the fingerprints and helps you find all the killers, right? And apparently there had been something done to it that like upgraded it. They had new technology that made it so that you could now identify more difficult fingerprints. And this was very useful because one of the fingerprints that they had from one of the murder scenes was taken off of like the dust of a TV set. So it was incredibly delicate. So they had been very careful with this particular print. So Arlington police take the fingerprints, put them into the system, and they rescan them. And guess what? This time they get a conclusive match to a man named Devon Scheanette. Now, why were police, just getting a match now? They had run the previous fingerprint and come up with no match. It wasn't just the APHIS thing that made it possible for them to get Dale now. And that's because when they had run his fingerprints previously, Dale literally did not have a criminal record, which seems wild. It seems crazy to think that somebody would just come out of the gate raping and murdering people, but he had no criminal record, which means either he had not done anything before or he had never been caught. Not until May of 1999, and that's when Dale was arrested and convicted of criminal mischief, which I don't even know exactly what that is, but he was given 12 months in jail for this crime, and that's when his fingerprints were subsequently taken, which ended up putting them into the system so he could be caught for these murders and rapes. Now, when police saw Dale's picture, heard his name, he was familiar to investigators, not because he was really on their radar as being guilty per se, but because records show that during the time that Wendie and Christine were murdered at the Pear Tree apartment complex, Dale had lived there at the time that these girls lived and died there. So because the fingerprints matched, police brought Dale in and questioned him, asked him about his connection with these women, if he knew them, if he had ever been inside their unit, if they were buddies, things like that. And he flat out denied it. So when police were like, okay, you have no connection to them. You've never been inside their apartments. Then how did your fingerprints get inside of both of these murder victims' apartments? And he had no explanation whatsoever. So like, okay, would you mind, one, giving us a DNA sample so we can exclude you, and two, would you mind like dropping trowel? Would you mind disrobing so we could look at your genitals? And he was like, no, I don't think I'm going to be doing that. And he would not allow them. So they ended up getting a court order. They took his DNA. They ran it against the two women in the rape cases as well. And they found that he was guilty and he was connected with all of these cases. And they also got a court order to be able to make him disrobe and show his genitalia. Because remember, Shima bit the shit out of him. And if the teeth marks fit, which they did. An investigator working on the case said of this time and this moment, and I quote, "We got a search warrant, blood samples, and made a hit on 2 murders. From that point, we started getting hits on other cases, the sexual assaults. It just snowballed." 27-year-old Devon Scheanette was arrested and charged with capital murder, which meant that he would be up for the death penalty. After his arrest, Dale was connected to the murders of Christine and Wendie, as we know, and he was also connected to the sexual assault of a total of 5 women in their apartments. He was a monster, dude. One of the women who was raped by him reported that during the rape, her 2-year-old son was there. Oh, it's gonna piss me off so hard. And that the little boy was like grabbing onto Dale's legs and like smacking him and crying and yelling at him to get off his mom. How fucking gross is that? Ugh. During the trial, Dale's defense attorney said, and I quote, "We put on our defense that the evidence was insufficient. But we were fighting that science. Fingerprints in the apartment, and they had DNA. That's some pretty strong stuff. Shima Benson said of sitting in the courtroom during Dale's trial, and I quote, "I wanted to jump across the podium and strangle him." A jury convicted Dale Devon Scheanette of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death for the murder of Wendie Prescott on January 8, 2003. Jurors deliberated for only 90 minutes before deciding he should die. So Dale was also charged with the murder of Christine, but for whatever reason, he was never actually tried for it, which I don't know why. For the life of me, I could not figure out why that was. I'm assuming maybe they thought because he was already being executed, he was already sentenced to death, that it wasn't worth the time or the money to have a trial. But either way, the fact that he was never found legally responsible for Christine's death seems kind of fucked up to me personally. I don't know. Let me know what you think. Christine's boyfriend, Thyme, who, if you remember, was the one who found her body in the bathtub that horrible day, said, and I quote, "I want the guy to look me in the eye and see what he did to me. I've waited to see someone go through a trial for this. The crime is unforgivable." And it's really sad because at least up to a point it was said that Thyme still carried a photo of Christine in his wallet. Poor fucking guy, dude. It's so messed up. After Dale was sentenced to death, Shima said of his sentence, and I quote, "Something as heinous as what he did deserved that kind of punishment. But something in me wishes he was in the general population, being raped by other convicts. You know what I mean? Being subjected to the same things we were subjected to." During the punishment phase of Dale's trial, the prosecution brought up all 5 of the rape victims who were still alive so that they could tell of their experience of them being forced at gunpoint or knife point to perform repeated sexual acts, and that Dale had threatened to kill them or their families if they didn't do what he said. And I think that those were probably some pretty impactful victim statements for the court. I am convinced that testimony of those 5 women was very therapeutic for them. It was a pretty moving event. It was a miracle he didn't kill any of the other women. The DA said of Dale, and I quote, "He personifies evil. I've been doing this 36 years. I've had others who have killed or done bad things. He is at the top of the list." After being convicted and sentenced to death, Dale fired his attorney and filed more than a dozen appeals, acting as his own attorney to try to get a new trial, whatever you do, last-ditch efforts to not be murdered by the state, but they were unsuccessful. He said that his rights were violated during the investigation, or that he had bad counsel, all of the typical things, but a judge was like, "Nah, dog, none of what you're saying is true, and you are still going to be executed," and he was scheduled to be executed. Dale's last meal was 2 spicy fried leg quarters, some French fries and ketchup, and 2 spicy fried pork chops, which I thought was odd because I remember when we did the Clutter family murder, that one of those killers made it so that you could no longer get a last meal, but I guess it must have just been in that state, because in this state he was still able to get a last meal in the 90s, or in the 2000s at this point, so that was what his last meal was. Dale declined to speak with reporters while on death row, and at his execution on February 10th, 2009, when asked if he wanted to make a last statement, he paused and then said, and I quote, "My only statement is that no cases ever tried have been error-free. Those are my words. No cases are error-free." The lethal injection was then started, and 9 minutes after injecting the drugs, 35-year-old Dale Devon Scheanette was pronounced dead at 6:21 p.m. 6 relatives of both Christine and Wendie watched Dale take his final breath, and he never even looked at them. And that, my friends, is the story of Dale Devon Scheanette, the bathtub killer. Isn't that so wild? Like, when I first heard about this case, every step of the way, I was just like, what? Like, there was just so many things that kind of blew my mind, and I cannot even imagine being the officers who are investigating those murders and walking into Wendie's murder scene and seeing the exact, like you're walking in, I picture it like a fucking episode of Dexter, where Dexter's walking in and as soon as he realizes what apartment complex he's at, it starts going in slow motion as he walks in and he sees the same door, the same living room, the same bathroom, a woman, the same woman, essentially. It's not the same woman, but that's how I picture it in my head, just all in slow motion, and realizing that it's the exact same crime scene. And that would absolutely blow my mind. And I know this isn't a TV show. This is a real life situation, which is even fucking worse. Like, to imagine that this really happened to these two innocent women. Like, it's so fucked up. And how ballsy to target women who live in the same apartment complex as you. It just seems like that's asking to be put on the radar, right? To like have police investigate you and look into you because you live in the same apartment complex. But I mean, that's not even what happened. Like, they knew who he was, but they weren't even on his radar. It's crazy. And in his case, this sort of de-escalation pattern is just so odd to me, to go from committing such brutal murders to going to just rapes. Like, not that rapes aren't fucking horrid, but you know what I mean? Like, how often can you think of any other killer who has gone from murdering to simply raping? I can't think of one in recent memory, but please let me know if you have. But anyways, guys, that completes this video. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and it gave you all the information you would want when looking into this case. And of course, I want you to thank you for remembering these poor women that he fucking brutalized with me today. Not just Wendie and Christine, because they obviously deserve being remembered, but also the 5 women that he raped, or at least the 5 that we know of. It's so terrifying to think of what these women went through. To think of those moments where this stranger comes into your house, and those final moments of just pure terror where you have zero control over what's happening to you. It's honestly too much to even think about. Anyways, guys, please let me know of any cases you would like to see me cover. As you know, I have a long list of cases that I plan to cover, but every time you leave me a case suggestion, I add it to my list so I can hopefully get to covering it. And if I do, I will give you a shout out because I know you're filled with good ideas and good taste. Otherwise, you would not be here. If you haven't already, please don't forget to join the Brat Pack by subscribing and ringing the bell. I put out a new video every single week, and I would love to hang out with you. Yes, you, specifically you. And if you want to hang out more consistently, all my social media is linked down below. Instagram, Facebook page, Facebook group, and a Twitter. All linked down there, along with all of the makeup I'm wearing, the earrings, this chipped nail polish. It's all linked down there for your pleasure, along with the link to my merch store in case you want a t-shirt or something. Right now it's just t-shirts, but maybe one day I'll add more things. I know you guys want more things. I'll get more things, I promise. And with all of that said, I just want to say thank you for being here when you could literally be anywhere else in the world. That is tight. You are tight. Please stay safe and be a better person than you were yesterday, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.